Hi, everyone. Hope you're having a good week. I wanted to make a few comments about our reading for this week on Bible criticism. You had two chapters this week. The first one was on social scientific criticism, and the second one is on gender criticism. Because we already read the Myers article and went over some things about social scientific criticism, I'm not going to cover that in detail here. I think the author of this chapter, particularly in the second half of the chapter, where she sort of digs into the issue of kingship and the Abimelech story, is pretty interesting. I'm probably less thrilled with the first part, but I think it's definitely worthwhile reading and gives you a little bit different perspective as to what a social scientific approach is to the Bible. But we've already talked about that, so I'm not going to spend any time here lecturing on that. So this should be relatively brief today. So today we're going to talk about gender criticism, which in some respects is very closely related to feminist criticism, but maybe has a slightly different twist on things. And it's always good for any time, any type of biblical criticism that you're looking at to first think about what types of questions does X group of biblical critics ask? What sorts of things are they interested in? So we'll follow the same approach here again. What questions do gender critics ask, and what are they looking for in the biblical text? And one of the questions that they ask is, what gender roles or norms are assumed in the biblical text? So, how does the Bible generally think about gender? How is gender constructed? What are the traits that go along with gender? What qualities seem to be prevalent in men or women? How are they portrayed? How are they idealized? Those types of questions as they are in the biblical text. Another important issue to think about is, how does gender shaming work in the biblical text? So every society has different ways of, I would say, maybe not coercing, but encouraging particular types of behavior. Um, and when they feel like those norms are violated, there's a process of shaming. And I think um, probably the best slash worst example of this that you can see these days is on social media. As soon as someone does something pretty horrific, um, and they get called out on social media, there's a lot of people waiting in the wings to tell them how bad their behavior is. So the Bible also, and I think any civilization, has ways of shaming people, has ways of trying to encourage people to fit in certain norms of behavior in their society. So it's important to look and see how that system works in the biblical text. Um, then, um, kind of paying special attention to points in the text when normative gender roles seem to be crossed, and what is the significance of that in the biblical text. So, not to just read past these things, but if somebody does something that seems like, oh, that's really unusual for a man to do that, or that's kind of unusual for a woman to do that, we should really pay attention to those moments, because even though we might not see them as significant, the Israelites may have seen those to be, wow moments, or very notable moments. And then, of course, there's this twofold um, understanding of biblical criticism. One is, how are these ideas constructed in the text? And then there's also the self reflection piece, just like we had last week with the post colonial readings, is how might our contemporary understanding of gender roles shape or bias our reading of Scripture? So we also, in our own time, have ideas about gender. what qualities should be associated with specific genders, places that those boundaries or those markers are violated, and sort of how we react to that. So we have to help name our own biases when we're looking at scripture, because if we don't, we could tend to read our own social constructs back onto the Bible when that's not what the Bible is trying to say. So easier said than done, but it's something that we need to try to pay attention to. So let's look at what I would call gender roles, general gender roles in the Bible. So males, you probably know this already, are dominant leaders, they're heads of households, they're typically the decision makers. So much of the Bible is devoted to talking about men, probably written by men, and a lot of it has to do with male power. So there's a lot of things in the Bible that sort of revolve around those issues. Strong warriors are often lifted up, men of valor, people that fight bravely. So all of those militaristic qualities that seem to be positive in the Bible. So these are positive traits. Males as protectors of women's sexuality. So we talked about this in the section on the first lecture on the social scientific approaches to the Bible, where men are one of their main duties is to protect the sexuality of the women in the household, because if that's violated, this could create issues relating to property and whether this woman's offspring are legitimate inheritors of the land. It could create problems in terms of a woman's value when she's married into another family, because if a woman doesn't have a very well understood sexual pedigree, this could definitely damage her value to the family. So there's a number of reasons why this is important. And a lot of it is also just sort of male pride involved in wrapped up in this. And females, so what are we looking for in ideal females? I would say for the Bible, women that bear children, particularly lots of children, are very fertile, are held up as examples in the scriptural text. Women, of course, that have a good sexual pedigree, clear sexual pedigree, I guess I should say. Women that manage their household, support their family, do all of the things that they're supposed to do, are a part of the female's gender role. So now let's look at the role of gender shaming and how crossing gender roles can result in gender shame in the Bible. So for males, in general, any show of weakness or submission we would imagine to be shameful for males. So probably one of the best stories that illustrates this is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. The men of Sodom try to shame the messengers of God by raping them, which would be an act of dominance over the messenger's submission. So in essence, trying to put them in a shameful position. And for that matter, this was a common practice in ancient Near Eastern warfare, particularly by the Assyrians. They would rape defeated troops to prove to them that they should feel and must feel ashamed because of their defeat. Failure to protect females, especially in the household, is a very shameful experience for the Israelites, and probably the best example of this can be found in Genesis 34 and the rape of Dinah. Dinah's brothers, the sons of Jacob, are outraged when they find out that their sister has been raped, and it seems that their outrage although it can't be necessarily said for sure, but it seems they are much more outraged about being ashamed from the fact that they have not protected the sexuality of their sister, rather than just simply from the fact that their sister has been raped. So, and then in order to avenge that rape, the men of Shechem must be wiped out, and they have an elaborate plan to do this. And at the end, they say, "Shall our sister be made into a whore?" So it doesn't seem to be so much an act of sympathy or revenge, but an avenging of the fact that the sons of Jacob have been made to feel shame. Um, Women who dominate or assume male roles could, in essence, end up shaming men. So then we wonder whether in the story of Deborah, whether Barak felt shame because here he was taking orders from a woman. I'm not sure. I will say that this was a very unusual situation in the biblical text. And in general, being compared to women. So in the book of Hosea, excuse me, one of the minor prophets, Hosea compares the leaders of Israel to a promiscuous woman. And he does this intentionally to try to sort of hit them over the head with a 2x4, saying, look at your relationship with Yahweh. You all are like promiscuous women. And how would you feel if your wife was being promiscuous? And so it's sort of a story of where men are led to understand how Yahweh feels about them using this idea of gender shame that is part of Israelite culture. Females, lack of fertility is very shameful. It's also very anxiety producing because women need children to be able to guarantee that they will be taken care of in their old age. And if they don't have children, they could be left homeless or worse. And so lack of fertility was seen as something very shameful for women. An uncertain sexual pedigree reduces the value of women in Israelite society. And defying male leadership generally could result in, I would say, maybe not so much shame for the women, but results in shame for the men who are being undercut, although it could work both ways. Finally, we need to think about our own ideas about gender and be very careful that we don't read our own ideas about gender onto the text or try to use the text to support what we may think about gender values or gender ideals. So similar to our post-colonial position that we talked about last week, our own social position may end up biasing our reading of the biblical text in a number of different ways that we might not always be able to predict. Thus, probably goes to say that women may read the biblical text differently than men. They may be more sensitive to some things that men may overlook. We have to be careful about employing ethical double standards or sort of something falling under the rubric boys will be boys. So we might tend to excuse violent, aggressive, dominant behavior by men in the Bible when in essence that's more of our own idea about how men should behave. And remember that the Bible is largely at least this particular part of the Bible is largely a self-critical piece. So just because the Bible reports something doesn't mean necessarily that the writers condoned what was going on or that we were to think that God condoned what was going on. So we have to be careful to not create some sort of ethical double standard, particularly when it comes to men and violence. We might also miss moments in the biblical text that are unusual or where gender expectations are defied. If those make us uncomfortable, we might tend to read past them. So I just threw out a couple of little examples here that I think are sort of interesting gender moments in the Bible. One being the story of Aksa, who we've spoken about earlier in this course. And Aksa is interesting because she's given away by her father to the winner of this battle, which is already kind of defying social norms for the Israelites. Although her father is a big warrior, so maybe we think, oh, warriors are great. He's a famous guy. Maybe this is okay, but maybe it's not. And then ultimately, not only is she given away to whoever wins the battle, but she's also given a crappy piece of property as a dowry. And she tells her husband to do something about that, and he doesn't really seem to want to kind of intervene in the situation, so she takes care of it herself. To me, that is a moment where gender expectations are crossed in the biblical text. And at least for me, you might not read it this way, but it seems like a moment that we should be paying attention to. It's just something unusual. Also, the story about Rebecca in the book of Genesis. I don't know how familiar you are with this story, but Abraham has a son, Isaac. He's 40 years old. He doesn't have a wife yet. He seems a little passive, perhaps. And so Abraham gets his servant to go back to the old country and find a wife for his son. So the servant goes to the local well and meets a woman. Apparently, this is the space in the ancient world where you meet women. And he finds a woman and begins negotiating to take her back with him back to the land of Canaan. And interestingly, the father and the brother of Rebecca say, well, this all sounds fine to us, but you better ask Rebecca what she thinks. And we might just read past that like, yeah, of course, the woman should have some input here. But in fact, that's really unusual in the Bible. We don't see a lot of cases where women seem to have input as to who it is that they're going to marry. Sometimes maybe a little, but oftentimes no. And sure enough, we find later in the story that Rebecca is indeed a strong figure, that she, in essence, tricks her husband into making sure that the inheritance goes to her favorite son, not to the eldest son, which tends to make her husband Isaac maybe look a little bad, maybe brings him a little bit of shame in the story. So these moments when roles are crossed or where the boundaries are pushed are, I think, important literary moments to pay attention to in the Bible. Excuse me. Then we finally shouldn't assume that Israelite society is normative and God ordained, especially when that sort of fits whatever idea of society we have, we're trying to advance. So that's not really a very good argument. For example, just because Israelite society is patriarchal or patriarchal light doesn't mean necessarily that we should have a patriarchal society. Just because Israelite men are allowed to be promiscuous, have multiple wives, visit prostitutes, but women have to stick with only one man, does that mean that that should be the norm for our own society? Or the fact, kind of looking at societal norms in general, there are a lot of laws in the Old Testament that talk about what Israelites should do when they own slaves. And these laws were used as justification for slavery in our own past, in our own country. So we have to be really careful when we try to transpose something that seems okay or a feature of Israelite society and assume that, well, this is God ordained and that, well, this is therefore the way our society should work. That isn't necessarily the case. Remember that Israel in many places is being critical of its own society and of its own ways. So we have to be really careful and think about our own position vis-a-vis gender and our own social roles as they relate back to Israel.
Anyway, I hope this is a little bit of a clearer introduction to gender criticism. Just some more things to be aware of as you're reading the biblical text. Hope you're having a great week, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks.